In this video, we'll be talking about primary keys and foreign keys. So let's actually start by primary keys. Now before actually starting primary keys and going into much detail, first we'll just have an example. Now consider this students table. So over here we have student ID, name, email and phone number columns. So we have 4 columns over here. Now for example, you want to delete the first one, that is Ola. So you want to delete that record. So what you could do is you could do like delete record where the name is equal to Ola. But there's a problem here. Now imagine you have like 10 students with the same name Ola. Then all of the 10 students will be deleted. So that's definitely not the way to go. So selecting based on the name is not ideal in this case. What you could do is you could select using student ID. So yes, that will work because each student has a unique student ID. So you can select using student ID. So if you want to make changes or delete the whole record, you can use it using student ID. So instead of deleting where the name is equal to Ola, we can do like delete where the student ID is equal to 3984. You can absolutely do like that because student ID is unique. Each student has different student ID. Now the same thing actually happens with email and phone number. So instead of student ID, you can use email also. So delete student where email is equal to ola@example.com. Now obviously each student has a unique email address. Now obviously 2 students cannot have the same email address. The same thing applies to phone number. 2 students will not have the same phone number. So you can either use student ID, you can either use email, or you can also use phone number for unique identification. So if you want to delete that particular record, like the first particular record, so definitely selecting by name is not the way to go because we can have multiple students with the same name. So our option is to use student ID, email or phone number because all these 3 are unique. So we can have student ID, email and phone number. So all of them are unique. So all of them can be used for unique identification like a representation. So all of these 3 are called candidate keys. So candidate keys means all the columns which are can be used as identification, like a unique identifier. So ola@example.com, that is unique for that particular student, and phone number also, that's particular unique, and also student ID is also unique for that particular student. No 2 students can have the same student ID, email or phone number. So these 3 are candidate keys. So these 3 are known as candidate keys because they're unique. They can be used as unique identifier. Now obviously we'll have just one unique identifier, so we have to decide which one to choose. Now out of all these 3, you can either choose student ID, you can choose email and you can also choose phone number because these are candidate keys. They are suitable for using them as unique identifier. But out of all these 3, I think choosing student ID is much more efficient, much more better, because email can change. Maybe the student changed his email, so the email will be changed. Now maybe they can change their phone number too. So they can change their phone number, they can change the email, or maybe just a student doesn't want to give his or her email. So maybe email or phone number can be null also. So email and phone number can be used as like an identification, a unique identifier, but I think using student ID is much more better. The whole purpose of the ID field is like for unique identification. So the key that actually we're going to use as a unique identifier, so that's called the primary key. So in our case, the primary key in this table is student ID because each student has a separate student ID, like a unique ID. So each student has its own unique identifier. So for Ola, 3984 is the primary key, like 3984 is its unique identifier. Another student cannot have the same ID that is 3984. The same thing for second one, that is Tove or Tove. So like 7184, that's particular for second student. So another student cannot have the same ID. So the one which you're going to use as a unique identifier, that's going to be a primary key. So actually out of all this, primary key is the most important. So now the rest of the keys which were left out, like we had like student ID, email and phone number, all of these 3 were candidate keys, which means they were suitable But out of all these three, we used only student ID because student ID looks much more better and much more reliable. So for student ID, we chose as primary key, and the rest of the students, the rest of the columns will be used as the alternate key. Now candidate key and alternate key is just as like the terms, but out of all these three, like candidate key, primary key and alternate key, the most important is primary key, because we're going to say SQL, like we are going to use student ID as the primary key for this table. So we have to specify SQL. Now till now, whatever tables we created, we didn't specify the primary key. Obviously it's not compulsory, but when we want a primary key, we have to say SQL, which column you want it to be primary key. So in our case, student ID, we're going to make it primary key. So student ID is now the primary key. Now consider this table. We have student ID, name, email, now school and school location, because we want to know student belongs to which school, right? Because not only the name and email, we also want to know in which school that particular student belongs. So we have decided to add school and school location also. So now just imagine, now ISB currently is India, for example. So now just imagine ISB tried to maybe change its branch. Now its new location is in Bahrain. So what you have to do is you have to go to each and every student and change the school location from India to Bahrain. So we have to go to the second one, that is 7184 Tove or Tove. So we have to go there and change the school location from India to Bahrain, and then we have to go to Kari, then India to Bahrain. So imagine we have like thousands and thousands of students. So we have to update the school location for each and every student, and that's not efficient. That's not and also now just imagine you have like another table called teachers. So teachers also we have to specify in which school they are teaching. So over there also we have to go and change the school location from India to Bahrain. So that's not practical. And also one more thing you have probably seen, that why are we storing school information in students table? Now students table means it should contain data solely about students, not about any other things. Like student ID is obviously related to students, so we can add it. Name also related to students. Email also related to students. But school location, maybe school pin code, year and all that information is actually related to school more than students. Students are just studying in that school. It's not part of their information, like the name, phone number, email and all. That's part of student, like information of student. But school name, school location and all that is actually part of school. So that should be actually made into a separate table, that is the school table. So instead of adding extra information into another table, we are going to split it into another table. So we are going to make two tables like this. The first table is called the students table, and the second table we are going to create the school table. So now you can see in the students table we have student ID, name, email and school ID. Now we're not saying about school name, school location, school year, school pin code and all that. We're not storing school information, like each and every information about school. We're just referencing to which school it actually belongs. So now the first student is Ola and the school ID is S023. So over there actually it belongs to ASB. So now we're actually just referencing to the schools table. We are not like storing school information in students table. We're just referencing it. So we just know like to which school it actually belongs. So you can see now we're not storing about school name, school location and all that in students table. We're just referencing it. And also you can see these two students are referencing to the second school, that is ISB. So now you can already imagine how easy that would be. So for example, now ISB changed from India to Bahrain, and then you have to just go to the schools table and change its location from India to Bahrain. That's all. Other all are just referencing it. So we don't have to go to each and every student, each and every teacher to just update the school location and all that. You have to just update the school location in the schools table, and other all will automatically be updated because they're not storing the information, they're just storing the reference. So if I say like get school location of Tove, now school location of Tove means first of all school ID is S501. So what is going to happen is going to check S501 in schools table, and over there you can see the location is India because the S501 is school is ISB and the location is India. So if you say like get school location of Tove, then we're going to get India. So that's like more reliable, more efficient instead of storing name, location and all that information in students table. Now this one is the primary key. Now obviously in students, student ID is the primary key, and in school the ID is the primary key. So S023 will solely belong to ASB, not any other school. So that is a unique identifier. So that is the unique identifier for ASB. And S501 is unique identifier for ISB. S309 is for NMS. So they cannot have like the same ID again and again. So each school has a unique identification. So we have decided that school primary key should be ID. And the referencing, like we are referencing school ID in students table. So that's actually called the foreign key, because like school ID is not like ID of the student, it's ID of the school. So that ID is actually in another table. So we are just creating a reference to the school table. So that's actually called the foreign key. So over there, like students table, we have like student ID, that is 3984, name is Ola, email is ola@example.com, and school ID, that's the foreign key. So we're saying that school ID is actually a reference to the primary key of the school table. Okay, so the school ID, that is S023, that's not part of the student information, that's actually a reference to the school table. So that's all about primary and foreign key. So primary key means a unique identifier of a particular record, and foreign key means a reference to another table, not a part of the student information actually. So that school ID, that's not part of students, that's actually a reference to the school table. Okay, now that we know about primary keys and foreign keys, let's actually create one. Now I'm going to create two tables, one for the customers and one for the orders, since we have a shop database over here. So first of all, I'll create a persons table with a primary key in it. So for creating a persons table, it's simple. Just type create table and persons, I'll just make it like customers. And then I have to specify all the columns. Like first of all, I'll specify the ID column. Now you can already imagine that this ID is actually the primary key. So ID, and then its data type, that is integer, and I'm just going to put like not null. Then for the first name, it's going to be a varchar of, let's say, like 220 characters, and this is also not null. And I'll just put a last name. This is also a varchar of 20 characters. This is also not null. And then I'm going to put age, that is an integer, again not null, and maybe their phone number. It's a varchar of 20 characters, not null, and it should be unique also, because obviously two person cannot have the same phone number, so I'll make it unique as well. And for the email also, it will be a varchar of 20 characters, not null, and also email also should be unique. Two people cannot have the same email. Okay, so now we have like set up the base for the table. We have created multiple columns with their data types, but yeah, again, one thing we missed is we didn't specify in which database we have to create it. So I'm just going to say use, and then the shop database. So shop. So now SQL knows that this table should be created in the shop database, but we still have an error. Let's see what's that. Oh yeah, it's not this, it's parenthesis, not curly bracket. Sorry for that. Okay, so now the error is gone. Okay, so now which column should we make it as a primary key? Because we already learned that primary key is a unique identifier for all the rows, like for a particular record. Now unique means it can be a phone number as well as email, right? Now phone number is also unique, email is also unique. Everyone has a unique phone number and email. So we can make that also as primary key, and as that is totally valid. But again, most of the time your primary key will be an ID. So in this case, this is a customer ID. So that's actually the most general use case. Primary key should be like an ID, like a unique identifier. Of course, there can be other columns which are unique, but typically you have to choose like an ID for something. So whenever you create a table, it should have an ID which should be the primary key. It's not necessary, but that's how actually you do it. Now, one thing you notice that we didn't specify unique for ID because we learned that primary keys should be unique, but by default it's going to automatically add because that's the nature of primary key. So even if we don't specify unique, it's going to add unique, and we have to specify not null, or else I think we get an error. So primary key should not be null, but by default it's not added. You have to add it, but for unique it's automatically added. So for creating a primary key, just like add it like this. So primary key, and then inside the round brackets just specify which column you want it to be a primary key. In our case is the ID column. So just put a comma, and over here just specify like primary key should be ID. So in this case, so if you wanted primary key should be, for example, phone number, you have to specify like this. If you want as email, then you have to specify like this. But currently we want ID to be primary key. So this is how you do it. So if I run the table, run the query, the whole query, and refresh it, you can see we got a customers table with all these. So let me just take a look at the table. You can see we have ID, first name, last name, age, phone number, email. Just ignore this null because we didn't add anything. So just you can ignore it for now. And this is how our table is. So let's look at the details of our table. So for that we have describe, if you remember. So describe, and then the name of the table, that is customers. So I'm going to run this line. So for running a particular line, only a single line, you can select this. So if I run this, you can see we got field, type is an ID, type is integer, a data type, not null, no, is null, no, that means it cannot be null. So that's what you're saying. Key, you see it's PRI, that's like a primary key. Now we got unique over here also, but that's like because it's a unique constraint. It has a unique constraint, if you remember. But this one also, we didn't specify that it's unique, but by default primary key is unique, so it's automatically going to add it. So you can see ID is a primary key. So we already defined that now ID is a primary key. So that's now, it's a unique identifier. So if we add new records, then ID, the ID of that particular record, is unique identifier. And default is null because we didn't specify the default value. So by default it's going to be null. But we also specify that it should not be null. So we're going to get error if we add not null or something like that. So we got ID, first name, last name, age, phone number, and email. Phone number and email are unique, and ID is also unique, but it's a primary key. It's an identifier for that record. Okay, this is how you add primary key while creating a table. So we created a customers table, and hence we added primary key like this. But what if you already have a table, but you didn't specify primary key while creating it? So if we go to our employees example, for example, so I'm just gonna write like describe shop dot employees. This simply means like in the shop database and the employees table. So it's going to describe it, like give us a little more information. So if I just run this query, you can see we got employee ID is a car and all the data types, and we got null. So null, no, that means it has a not null constraint. But you can see over here key, we don't have primary key. If we go over here and just run this part of the file, you can see we got PRI, that is a primary key. ID is a primary key in our case, because while creating the customers table, we specified that primary key is ID. But over here we already created an employees table long ago, and that time we didn't know about primary keys, so we didn't add primary key while creating the table. Now the table is already created. Now how do we specify that employee ID has to be a primary key? Well, you can, if you remember, if you want to modify a table, you have to specify alter command. So alter employees, like that. So let's actually do that. First of all, I'll use this use command. It's much more easier. So use shop. So this thing is much more easier than specifying every time shop.employee, shop.employees. We're just specifying shop just once. And now we have to alter that employees table. So first we're saying alter table, and then we're saying employees. So first of all, we're telling SQL that make changes to the table, alter the table. And now we have to specify what change we have to make. We already specified SQL that we are changing the table, and now we have to specify what change we are making. Last time we learned how you can create a new column, how you can change the data type of a column and all that. Now let's learn how you can create a primary key. So first of all, alter the table, and then you have to use add primary key, and then in the parenthesis or the round brackets, you have to specify which column has to be primary key. So in our case, it's employee ID. So I'm just going to specify employee ID, like that. So first of all, we told SQL that we are using the shop database, and in there we are altering the table employees. We are changing the table. Now what change we are making? We are adding a primary key to the employee ID field or employee ID column. So if I run this whole file, you can see it was successful. Now if I go and describe our table, that is the employees table. Okay, we got an error. Oh yeah, because we didn't specify semicolon over here. So if I run this, you can see employee ID now has a primary key, PRI. Before it didn't have that, because obviously we didn't specify it was a primary key table, primary key column. But now we specified it. We changed the table. Before we specified it's a primary key while creating a table, but now we are changing the table to specify it has a primary key, because before we didn't know about primary keys, so we didn't add it before while creating a table like this. So we created a table and added the primary key, but now we changed the table to add a primary key because this table was created long ago. Okay, now that we have created a table, let's actually insert values into it. So insert into, and then the name of the table, that is customers, and then we have to specify all the column names. So I'm just going to insert like the ID, ID, first name, last name, age, phone number, email. So yeah, we added all of these. Oh yeah, we have to make phone number as an integer, but I specified it as varchar. No problem. Next, just make sure it's a number in your code, not varchar. By mistake I wrote it. So insert into values, and then we have to specify the values. So we'll make ID as 1 and first name as, and then the last name, the age, then the phone number. So I wrote phone number as in varchar, so in double quotes, some random number, and the email. So maybe So we're going to insert a value. Now I'm going to press this button. Now this button means execute only one line. So you might be thinking it will execute only this line, but actually this whole thing is one line. If you remember, we just split it into different lines so that it's easier to read. So in reality, this is actually one line. We just put it in another line for easiness of reading. So even if I put my cursor here and press this button, both of these lines are going to run because both of these lines are actually part of one line. So I'll just keep my cursor over here and run that. Okay, successfully inserted. And if I go to customers table and refresh, you can see we got ID, first name, last name, age, phone number, and email. So now that was successful. So now if I have to reference this particular customer, like this particular customer, so its unique identifier, its identity is this ID because it's a primary key. So for example, I have like 100 customers. If I have to reference one, or if I have to delete one, or if I have to do something with only one of them, then I have to reference that with the ID. Because for example, if I just reference that with the name, for example, the name, there can be multiple customers with the same name, so all of those will be affected. So if you want to just delete one customer with this name, then all of the customers with this name will be deleted. So you can use phone number or email because that's also unique, but you have to use the primary key for all the operations. Now we learned how you can create a primary key while creating the definition of a table, and also how to alter the previously created table for adding a primary key. Now there's also option to delete the primary key. Now most likely you're not going to do that, but I'm just going to show how you can delete it. But again, I'm saying this is like a very rare chance you will ever do this. So this is just for the sake of teaching I'm going to show, but most probably you're never going to use this. So how you can delete a primary key. For deleting a primary key, first of all, you're saying the table that we're making changes. So we are altering the table. And then we know that for deleting in SQL it's called dropping. Like if you wanted to delete a database, it is drop database. If you want to delete a table, then it's drop table. So now again, you can guess it. If you wanted to add, it's like add primary key. Now if you want to delete the primary key, it's drop primary key. So drop primary key, like that. And now our primary key is employee ID. So now employee ID will be dropped. I mean, the column will not be dropped, just the status of the primary key will be dropped. So now employee ID won't be deleted, it will be there, but now it will no longer be a primary key. Okay, so if I run this line, you can see it was successful. Now if we describe the employees again, you can see employee ID was not deleted, but its key is gone before it has a PRI, that is primary key, but now it doesn't have a key. So the column is not itself deleted, just it is no longer a primary key. Okay, now we learned how you can create a primary key. Now let's learn how you can create a foreign key. So for that, I'm going to create another table called the orders table. So over there, we're going to store all the orders, like the order number, and all that information. So let's create a new table called orders, and over there we're going to add a foreign key. So let's actually create a table. So create table and then orders, and then I'm just going to specify all the columns. So let's say I have order ID. Now you can already imagine that this order ID is actually the primary key because it's like a unique identification for this table, for all the rows. So order ID, and it should be an integer and then not null, like that. And then order number, it should also be an integer and not null. And then like the customer ID, for example, customer ID, it should be an integer. Now what this customer ID is, it's like the reference to customers table. So this is actually our customers table. So whenever we create a new record for the orders table, so it will contain the order ID the order number, and who ordered it. So for instead of who ordering it, instead of storing all the name, the information and all that, we can just create a reference to the customers table over here. So we can do like who ordered it and then their ID. So for example, 1 over here. So now we just, instead of storing the first name, last name, age and all that into the orders table, we're just storing the reference to the customers table. So over here, for example, a new order is created. So order ID is 1, order number, for example, 394765, like some random number, and then customer ID, the reference. So that reference we're saying, for example, 1. So now the SQL knows that actually the reference is 1 over here. So now obviously the SQL knows that it's like the first name is this one, last name, age, phone number, email. So we're just creating a reference. So you already know what's like a reference versus storing everything inside the table. So we're just creating a reference to the customers table. So this is how we created the table. And now we have to specify what is the primary key and what is the foreign key, because by default, how will SQL know what is foreign key and what is primary key? So for creating the primary key, it's like primary key, and then we have to specify in parenthesis like which column is the primary key. So in our case, order ID is the primary key. So I'll just copy paste, so you can see order ID is the primary key. Now we have to specify the foreign key. Now obviously customer ID is the foreign key because that's the reference to another table, that is the customers table. So I have to specify like this. So foreign key, and then we have to specify which column is the foreign key, that is customer ID. So this one. So I'm just copying this and pasting it here. So now we're saying that the foreign key is customer ID. But we told that the foreign key is customer ID, but we didn't say to which table is actually referencing. So you can see customer ID will obviously reference to the customer table. So that we know, but SQL doesn't know in which table you have to look. You can see we have customers table, employees table, pets table. So we have 3 tables. So how will SQL know that this customer ID belongs to the customers table? We didn't specify. We told that it's a foreign key, that is, it's a reference to another table, but we didn't say which table. So for specifying it, it's references, and then we have to specify which table we are referencing. So in our case, this customer ID is the reference for the customers table, not employees table, not pets table. It's the reference to customers table. So references and then customers, the name of the table. So the name of this table. So it's customers. So references customers. And then we have to specify which is the referencing, referencing column. Now we are referencing the primary key, obviously. So this is the ID. So over here we have the ID. So it's like that. So ID. So let me just recall what we did here. First of all, we are creating a table. And yeah, obviously we didn't specify in which database we have to create the table. So use shop. Okay. So first we're telling SQL to use the shop database. In that database, create a table called orders, and the columns should be order ID, order number, and customer ID. Now order ID, we are saying that it's a primary key. So we told primary key, and then we specified which column is that is order ID. So this order ID is the same thing as this order ID. Okay, so that's the primary key. So we are saying SQL what is primary key. The foreign key we have to say. The foreign key is this customer ID. So this particular column, so we are creating this orders table. So this column is a foreign key. So we're telling SQL like foreign key, and then we are telling which column is that. So this customer ID is this customer ID. And then we have to say references. So references, we have to obviously specify which table is actually referencing, because we told that it's customer ID, but SQL doesn't know to which table to reference it. SQL knows that it's referencing to some other table, but it doesn't know which table. So we have to specify references and the name of the table, and then which column is actually referencing. So customer ID is actually, we are referencing this ID, right? So whenever we create a new record customer ID, we are actually referencing the ID column of the customers table. So we have to specify customers table and then which column we are actually referencing. So that's the ID column. So run the file, no errors, and if I refresh over here, and you can see our new table was created, orders. You can see we got orders, we got order ID, order number, and customer ID. And if you use describe here, describe shop.orders, over there, just run this. You can see order ID is a primary key and customer ID is MUL. I don't know what's MUL, but it's definitely a foreign key because we told it's a foreign key. So I'm not sure like what's the full form of MUL. PRI definitely means like primary key. So MUL I'm not sure, but it's definitely like foreign key. So now we told SQL that order ID is the primary key, order number is like the normal column, and customer ID is the foreign key. Now foreign key references to which column? It references to which table? It references to the customers table, and the customers table the ID column. So we are referencing this. So we are referencing this column in this customer ID. So now actually let me create a new new record and actually show you what's happening. So I'll just create like insert into and orders, okay, like that. And then I have to specify semicolon. So insert into orders, and then we have to specify all the column names. So the column names, we have order ID, order ID like that, order number, and customer ID. Okay, so like that, and then values, and then we have to specify what values we are inserting. So first of all, order ID. Now order ID is a primary key, it's like a unique ID. So let's say we say like this is the order ID. So this is the order ID, okay, and then we have to specify the order number. Let's say order number is just some random number, and then the customer ID. This is the customer ID table. It's a foreign key table. So now which customer actually ordered this order? I mean, like which customer this order belongs to? Now the order belongs to, we have only one customer, so the order belongs to this customer. So now we should not put the name, we should not put the last name, because we told that it references the ID column in the customers. So we have to say like the number 1. So we are saying like number 1. So now what happens? Insert into the orders table. Order ID is this, like this is the primary key for the orders column. Order number is this one, and who ordered it? That is the customer ID. Customer ID is 1. So this one actually refers to 1 in the customers table. Okay, so if you had like 10 customers and number 8 ordered it, so we have to specify like number 8. So this 8 is actually the ID in the columns table. So number 8 customer ordered it. So for now we don't have like number 8 customers, we have only 1. So we have like this. So if I run this inserting part, okay, we got an error, out of range. So let's see what's the problem. Yeah, okay, because this number was like too big, so I'm just going to reduce the size of the number and run it again. Okay, we didn't get any error. And let's actually look at our orders table. So I'm just going to go over here. Orders table was empty. Now if I just run this select part, you can see we got a new order ID, that is the primary key, like unique identifier for this particular order. Okay, and then order number, so that's the order number, and then customer ID 1, that is customer ID with the customer with the ID 1 actually took this order. Okay, so customer with the ID 1. Now the customer with the ID 1 is this one, Hansen, Ola. So Ola actually ordered this. So that's how you do it. Instead of writing the first name, last name, age, all that information, we just wrote the customer ID. And now SQL actually takes care that this customer ID belongs to this particular record. So ID is 1, first name is Hansen and Ola and all that. So now actually we are seeing only the ID. We're not seeing other information. So how we'll know other information? That's actually like joining the tables. That is like a complex lecture. So that's like for another lecture, another video. So for now, actually just be happy and just be proud that you learned about primary key and foreign keys. So primary key is like a unique identifier, and foreign key is actually referencing to another table. So that's how you create a foreign key. Now we added a foreign key while creating a new table. If you already have a table and it foreign key doesn't have, then how you do is it's same like the primary key. So over here we had like alter table employees, then add primary key. So over here also we have like alter table employees and then add foreign key, and then we have to specify like which column is actually the foreign key. Now in our case we don't actually have a column for foreign key because okay, let's say like shop ID like that. This is just fictional, okay? So shop ID is the foreign key, and then references shop table, for example. So like actually you can see like you actually oh no wait, just put ID over here. Yeah, okay. So actually you can see the same like adding a primary key, but what all you wrote over here, the same thing you have to write over here, but like alter table employees and then the same thing over here. So same thing as primary, and you can already imagine if you want to drop the foreign key, it's pretty simple. For dropping the foreign key is just like alter table employees and then drop foreign key like that, and then you have to specify which foreign key, because a table can have multiple foreign keys. So you have to specify actually which column foreign key you want to remove. So if you want to remove customer ID, so you have to specify like customer ID like that. So we're telling alter the table employees and drop the foreign key customer ID. Now obviously employees doesn't have the customer ID. This is just for showing. I'm not going to run this. It's definitely an error. So I hope you learned how you can create a foreign key while creating a new table, or if already have a table, then how to add a foreign key and then how to delete the foreign key. So that's all for this video. You learned how you can create primary and foreign keys, how you can set references and all that. So that's for today.